Hello and welcome to MAGA, the podcast. Now, remember, this is not your Christian nationalist cousin's MAGA. Our MAGA stands for I'm an Angry Asshole, the cult of Donald Trump. The mission of our podcast is to show how Don the Con bamboozled our nation. Our goal is to help make sure that the cult of MAGA goes down in flames by 2028. We want to stop it before MAGA becomes unstoppable and our democracy decays into a dictatorship. Now, it's been a little over 6 weeks since Trump has assumed office, and it's been mass chaos. And maybe it feels sometimes like this chaos is overwhelming, and it is. We also need to recognize that this chaos has been put in place by design, a design that actually started back in Trump 1.0. And that's why it's important for us to remember, if we want the cult of MAGA to end, we have to know how it began and why it spread. We have to go back to the election of 2016. So who am I and why am I leading this journey? So there are a couple of things I bring to the table during this journey. I am a talented storyteller and a social doctor. I spent 18 years as a management consultant and also was in the TV development programs at 2 major networks. As part of my work, I've dealt with all kinds of social problems that come from people, systems, and power. So my hope throughout this podcast is for us to help make sense of MAGA via my strengths of storytelling and problem solving so we can sort out how to get out of this mess. On last week's episode, we talked about the original formula for Trump's snake oil. The basic ingredients at the time were anti-elitism, this idea that experts don't know anything and you can just get rid of them because they're interchangeable. This whole Doge clusterfuck, getting rid of people who are actually good at things without understanding or realizing how important they are, right out of the original MAGA playbook of being anti-elitist, anti-expert, anti-folks who actually know what they are doing. It's also anti-establishment. Right, this idea that there's a deep state trying to trick you and you need altruistic billionaires like Elon Musk to help you save the day. There's anti-fact checking, so no real objective reality. And finally, the idea that Trump and only Trump could help save the day. Now, despite having this really potent snake oil recipe, Roger Stone and Trump still needed to figure out a way to spread the word because Trump still faced a really nearly impossible mission back in the early days of the 2016 presidential race. He was going up against 16 more established candidates, and how do you stand out in such a gigantic field? So that brings us to this week's episode, Bam Bam's Big Idea. So first, what was Bam Bam's big idea, right? What was he trying to do that was going to help solve the current problem Trump and Stone had, which is they had a really potent snake oil recipe. But how do you distribute this message and make sure that word gets out? How do you make sure this message is actually treated like news and repeated over and over again? So this episode is going to really help us understand how Breitbart and Trump acted like steroids for each other and help fuel the growth of the entire alt-right. So before we get into Bam Bam's backstory, I want to take a moment to share a story that illustrates the power of fear. And this story takes place quite a long time ago, back on October 30th, 1938, when 23-year-old Orson Welles and his Mercury Theater on the Air performed a radio adaptation of H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds. Now, the format of this radio show was that it'd be a regular show interrupted by breaking news bulletins describing a Martian invasion of New Jersey. Now, everyone involved with the War of the Worlds broadcast, the performers themselves, thought the story was too silly to ever be taken seriously. But during the actual night of the performance, and remember back then, things were taped live, the performers realized that something serious was going on when the police showed up at CBS studios where the drama was being performed. And a struggle broke out between the cops and radio executives who were trying desperately to prevent them from bursting in and stopping the show. It turns out that some listeners actually mistook these bulletins for the real thing. And they tried to call police and newspaper offices and even radio stations, tying up the phone lines.
All of the primitive fear of the unknown awakened within me, robbing me of all reason.
I was crying so hard. My sister woke up and wanted to know what I was crying for. Well, she listened.
A few years ago, I nearly drowned, but God only knows those few minutes were nothing at all compared with the torture I went through last night.
Newspapers later reported that anxious listeners, believing that the end of the world was near, tried to flee their homes in terror, or they gathered weapons and prepared to defend themselves against the alien hordes. Wells later claimed that he heard reports of mass stampedes, of suicides, and of angry listeners threatening to shoot him on sight.
I had no idea that I'd suddenly become a sort of national event. And it was immediately after our show went off the air that Walter Winchell, who was on a rival network and had heard about how all the telephone lines had been jammed and all the excitement going on, went on the air on his network, on his program of news commentary, and said, "Mr. and Mrs. America, there is no cause for alarm. America has not fallen. I repeat, America has not fallen." It's only a little while ago that I again ran into some Quakers and Red Cross people who had been up in the Black Hills of Dakota some 5 or 6 weeks after this broadcast, persuading the people to leave the mountains and go back home because Martians really hadn't come.
Instead, something remarkable and distinctly modern happened that night. In 21st century terms, the fake news went viral. Dozens upon dozens of letters describe people hurrying to spread word of the invasion to friends and neighbors, or calling up relatives to warn them about the disaster. Switchboards lit up coast to coast as people called police, newspapers, and radio stations trying to figure out if the fake news was real.
Someone came crying out, "A rocket is coming from Mars. We're all going to be killed."
The church had cleared and everybody was on the way home to gather their loved ones to safety.
As matters now stand, I am an ass, for I had called many of my friends and suggested that they leave their homes immediately, and am being ridiculed for my actions.
As word of the invasion passed from person to person, it grew distorted and more believable. The Princeton study later found that only about a third of frightened listeners understood that the show described an alien attack. Most thought it was an earthly invasion or some kind of natural disaster. The hysteria that night had as much to do with the power of rumor as it did with the power of radio.
So there are a couple of really important lessons about this ancient event from almost 100 years ago. One, when people are afraid, they get panicky and crazy. People actually chose to believe that the entire planet was being taken over in less than 40 minutes. And when people are panicky and afraid, they don't bother to check things out. A lot of folks didn't bother to check other radio stations to see if anyone else was reporting this earth-shattering news that the Martians were coming.
Wondered whether Americans could be just as easily manipulated by the mass media, and whether democracy could even survive in a nation beset by such idiocy.
If the American people are as gullible and excitable as that, a smooth-tongued orator could soon turn their head.
I'm not afraid of an invasion from Mars. I'm afraid of a non-intelligent public in a democracy.
The second important lesson from this broadcast is that when guardrails are not in place to stop a panic, when there's no emergency brakes, things can spiral way out of control. Now, at the top of the broadcast, there was a warning that this was just a radio show. But the folks at Mercury didn't realize that people who tuned in late would miss that warning. The other big emergency break back during the days of radio occurred at the half-hour mark, where programs would stop for commercials. Breaking news, on the other hand, didn't have to follow that rule. So people who were really into the broadcast and starting to panic really began to believe it was real when the station did not break at 8:30 for commercials. And people who were already afraid really started to lose their shit. So the moral of this story, right, is when people are afraid, they get panicky and crazy, and logic goes right out the window. Let's talk a bit more about those emergency brakes I was mentioning a moment ago. Back before the advent of cable TV and the internet, and I know I may be dating myself a bit, but it really wasn't that long ago. When it came to helping people make sense out of events and experiences, Legacy media played a really important part. Things like network television and newspapers, the radio still was a big deal, and magazines were the way people got their news, right? The way that they thought about and processed the world around them. And back then, the emphasis was more on being right, not necessarily on being first. This is not from nobility. There are still plenty of tabloidy, bullshitty things that were happening back then. But with the speed of things happening, the fact that it took at the very least a day or so before the word was spread. So the emphasis was on being right, not necessarily on being first. Credibility was important. Reputation was more important than being first because we still had a relatively slow schedule, right? Maybe once a day, people would check in on the news. This all changed with the advent of cable news and the 24-hour news cycle. Now, all of a sudden, these networks had 24 hours a day to fill, not half an hour a day like we were used to on network television. And so they needed breaking news all the time to keep people watching. They needed things for people to talk about.
When he starts talking about the Mexican rapists and everything like that, I go, oh my God. I said, he's just buried everything. They're going to go, CNN is literally going to broadcast 24 hours a day. He goes to Iowa, I think that night, it's all they talk about.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And this pressure really accelerated with the advent of the internet. And suddenly the priority flipped, not necessarily to being right, but to being first. Because what networks and websites started to realize is people stopped paying attention to accuracy. Sensational headlines, feelings, reposts, and likes were the currency of the day. So this started to nibble away at objective reality until facts are challenged by alternative facts. And nobody can seem to agree on anything. Going from first, not right, instead of right and not first, inherently and dramatically changed the game when it came to the news. So let's think about and talk about how Steve Bannon changed media. This idea of moving from legacy media to internet media. This idea, again, of being first, not right. So Steve Bannon, also known as Bam Bam, Sloppy Steve, Darth Bannon, Homeless Guy, Robert Redford, Dredged from a River, and the Build a Wall Bandit, which is my favorite because one of the things that Bannon did was convince a bunch of rubes to send him money to build the wall, and then he balled out with the funds. Now, originally he was a Navy man. After his military service, Bannon worked at Goldman Sachs as an investment banker in mergers and acquisitions. He moved west for their burgeoning entertainment interest, and in the 1990s, Bannon left Goldman Sachs and launched his own boutique investment bank company specializing in media. It's called Bannon and Company. So in the 90s, these folks ventured into Hollywood and produced 18 movies. And Bannon really learned to tell stories, and that was fundamental to his relationship with Trump and involvement in Trump 1.0, occurred in 2007 when he co-founded Breitbart News. The second piece, which occurred in the mid-2010s, was when Bannon was a vice president of Cambridge Analytica, a firm that collected data on millions of Facebook users without their informed consent. And this company was owned by a family that also happened to co-own Breitbart. So today we're going to focus on the first thing, Breitbart News, and how Breitbart changed everything. In March 2012, following the death of Breitbart News founder Andrew Breitbart, Bannon became the executive chairman of Breitbart News, LLC. Back then, there was a lot of congestion amongst center-right platforms. Breitbart was duking it out with the National Review, the Weekly Standard, the Washington Examiner, the Daily Caller, the IJ Review, the Washington Free Beacon, Red State, and all of these folks were duking it out, but no one had really established themselves as the go-to outlet for Republicans the way that the Huffington Post was an outlet for liberals. Bannon decided not to enter this cluster of center-right. Instead, he led Breitbart to the far right, also known as the alternative right or the alt-right, which, for those that are not familiar, is a series of ideologies, groups, and individuals whose core belief is that white identity is under attack by multicultural forces using political correctness and social justice to undermine white people and their civilization. So we can see how Trump's 2.0 attack against DEI stems from the mainstreaming of these alt-right views. A couple of characteristics of the alt-right is their heavy use of social media and online memes, and their hatred of establishment conservatism. They tend to skew young and embrace white ethno-nationalism as a fundamental core value. So under Bannon's leadership, Breitbart News editorial tone becomes much more nationalistic, extreme, and abrasive. Philip Elliott and Zeke Miller of Time described the site as pushing racist, sexist, xenophobic, and anti-Semitic material into the veins of the alternative right. Add that to the racism. Now, Bannon framed this online media battle as a confrontation between the status quo in Washington and everyone else in America who felt like they were being screwed by a broken system. Now, speaking about his role at Breitbart, Bannon described it as, "We think of ourselves as virulently anti-establishment, particularly anti the permanent political class." So ideologically, very similar to Roger Stone. And we can see why he was able to pick up the mantle from Stone. During this time period, Breitbart becomes the central hub for disgruntled Americans to congregate around daily. Breitbart would be the place where readers could channel their anger and frustration, where they could also be told who was responsible for all their problems. Steve was described to run the site and control the site as a dictator, not only limiting the expression of his journalists, but also purposely changing the narrative to increase vitriol and play to the fears of his readers. This is from Kurt Bardella, who worked for Breitbart during the 2016 campaign season. So how did Breitbart make it big under Bannon? One of their signatures was that they used bare-knuckled headlines that peddled an outrage. Things like, "Would you rather your child had feminism or cancer?" "Gay rights have made us dumber. It's time to get back in the closet." "There's no hiring bias against women in tech. They just suck at interviews. And science proves it. Fat shaming works." So with a resume like this, probably not a surprise that in 2014, Breitbart was cited as having worse journalism by the Columbia Journalism Review. Angelo Carusone of the left-leaning watchdog group Media Matters for America described Breitbart as offering a veneer of being a media organization, but they have no noticeable editorial standard or journalistic practices. They do function like a political organism. So from this point of view, right, if they're acting like a political organism, masquerading as news, then this is effectively cutting the emergency brake when it comes to Americans making sense of events and experiences. If there's no journalistic integrity, if there's no editorial standards, then it doesn't really matter what you say because there's no reputation cost and people don't remember. It's about being first, not about being right. Now, love them or hate them, it worked.
Nightly setup of Kimmel and all the Tonight Show and all that is politics. And why is that? You now have people that are engaged. They bought in, and it's aspirational. It's part of their lifestyle. It's like you wear a certain brand of shirt, you have a certain brand of politics.
Readership exploded from 2.9 million unique visitors in 2012 to over 17 million in 2016, making it the most read conservative news website in the United States. And in 2016, Bannon formally declared the website as the platform for the alt-right. Kurt Bardella, the guy we mentioned earlier that used to work for Breitbart, described it as follows. I could see that Steve had built an incubator for rage and was ready to weaponize it by unleashing these disenchanted Americans on the political establishment. But Bannon still had one big problem. Even though the anger was there, the mob was there, the readership, the website reach was there, he didn't have a figurehead to lead his movement. During this episode, we covered this idea of fear and anger and its impact on American voters, the migration from legacy media to new media, and how this legacy really cut the emergency brake in terms of how people made sense of what was going on around them. Some of the culprits of cutting these brakes was Breitbart and their pushing of the alt-right from the fringes into the mainstream, which is really one of the biggest legacies that they have. They took this bunch of crazy ideas, these white nationalistic ideas, these xenophobic, misogynistic ideas. They took them from the fringe and made them mainstream. So we'll put a pin in the story for now. Next week, we'll be back with part 2 of Bam Bam's Big Idea, where we'll take a deeper dive into how Bam Bam and Trump actually eloped and started their political marriage over the flaming corpse of Megyn Kelly. And we're also going to get into the nefarious strategy that Bannon developed during Trump 1.0 that is absolutely pushing this country to the brink of disaster just 6 weeks into Trump 2.0. So I want to thank you all again for tuning in to today's episode. If you want to help out the channel, please subscribe or follow the podcast and tell your fellow disgusted Americans all about us and where they could find us. As a reminder, new episodes drop on Wednesdays. So talk to you folks again in about a week. Until then, have a great day. Thanks for tuning in. Ciao, bacalao.